So welcome everyone. I'm so excited to have everyone back. It's been a little while since our last presentation. My name is Abby Currier and I'm the Community Engagement and Events Coordinator here at the History Center of Olmsted County. I'm so excited to see everyone on here tonight and I look forward to learning more this evening about wastewater treatment. Here at the History Center of Olmsted County, we invite people to gather, socially distant of course, and explore and examine our past as we educate ourselves about the stories of Olmsted County in southeastern Minnesota. We're so excited that you have decided to join us tonight as we take a look at one of these stories. Tonight, we're going to have a presentation from Corey Bjornberg on the history of wastewater treatment in Rochester. After his presentation, we'll have about 15 minutes for questions from the audience. During the presentation, feel free to put any questions you may have in the chat feature, and we will try to answer as many of them as we can. But before we can get started, I just want to go over a couple of logistical things. For tonight, we are going to keep all of you muted so that we can listen to our speaker. Like I said, if you have any questions, drop them in the chat and we will do our best to answer as many of them as we can. We may also put some links in there throughout the night, so make sure to keep an eye on it. If you're interested, the chat feature is at the bottom of your screen, and I believe it's the third icon to the right. It looks like a little message or a speech bubble. Anything that we put into the chat, we will be sure to send to you tomorrow, along with a quick survey about tonight's program. It will take less than 2 minutes to fill out, and we really appreciate your feedback. We also recommend watching this in presenter view, but if you want to see everyone participating Brady Bunch style, you can do that by clicking on presentation view in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. If you are joining us from an iPad, you may have to swipe your screen a couple of times to switch the view. We are recording tonight's program, so please keep that in mind. We're so excited about tonight's talk and hope that you will continue to join us for some of our future events, where we're going to talk about everything from same-sex marriage to voting rights to automation in farming and so much in between. These talks are one of the many great benefits to having a membership to the History Center of Olmsted County. We certainly hope that you will continue to join us for these talks, and we also hope that you will consider getting a membership to experience even more benefits. Tonight, we are joined by Corey Bjornberg, who is originally from Wilmar, Minnesota, where he grew up on a family farm. He received his bachelor's in civil engineering and master's in environmental engineering from the North Dakota State University in Fargo, North Dakota. While at North Dakota State University, he worked part-time for approximately 3 years at the Moorhead Wastewater Treatment Facility. After graduation, he worked for a consulting firm for almost 4 years, where he performed studies and design work on various wastewater treatment plants in Ohio. For the last 8 years, he has been with Rochester as a process control engineer, where he oversees plant performance and is continually working on plant optimization to reduce cost. Corey?
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. Before I get started, I just want to say, a lot of the questions I get asked, how did you end up in the wastewater field, and why did you enter the wastewater field? Reality is that when I went to school, I was going to become a structural engineer. I really liked the idea of building until I took one structural class and realized it was incredibly boring. Turns out I was also taking an environmental engineering class, which focuses on water and wastewater treatment. And actually, I know this is bizarre, but just fell in love with the science and the treatment of wastewater. It's a really unique field, a really interesting field. So I'm going to go over a kind of wide variety of topics. First of all, what is wastewater and why do we care? We're going to talk a little bit about the general history of wastewater before we get to Rochester specifically. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the future. There's a lot of interesting things going on here in Rochester as well, just with the science in general. I know a lot of people think of wastewater. They think of the famous outhouse up above in this picture. But the reality is you can see the Rochester plant here, picture below. And it's a very advanced facility, as most wastewater plants are now. So there's a lot of science going on. And it, like I said, it's just a really interesting field. So what is wastewater and where does it come from? Well, wastewater can be really just, it's it's water that's been contaminated by us humans. That can include domestic, industrial, commercial. It's amazing. It doesn't take much to pollute water. The water we get coming into the plant is still 99.9% water. We are treating the other 0.1%. Doesn't seem like a lot, but if I showed you a picture of our influent stream, you definitely can tell it's not a clean water. And the way I like to compare it is most cities, most towns, the flow is driven by the amount of people. You can kind of compare that to an interstate. The amount of lanes we need is based on the number of cars we have. However, a lot of places, depending on the city and what industries are in town, the loading, which is the 0.1%, is a lot of times driven by industries. And going back to my analogy of a road, the thickness of a road is designed for the weight of the heavy vehicles, the semis, the trucks. So we know not only have to treat the flow, which is just general population, but the load of pollutants, which can be affected by industries and has been in Rochester. I do have this image here. One of the things I want to show folks is that any drain in your house, a bathroom, a toilet, a sink, that's going to go into a sanitary sewer. This, a lot of people get this confused with your storm laterals. So you should say historically that they can be combined, but in Rochester, they're always separated. So, and the reason for that is the reality is when we get big rains, the flow goes way up. If we have a really high flow, our plant needs to handle that. So there's more, essentially you need to build a larger plant if you're going to treat the stormwater. So we like to separate those out. So there are differences. And I always like to plug, if anyone's out there, there's some pump should discharge not to a sanitary sewer. It should go to a storm sewer. So again, why do we care about wastewater? I think for many of us kind of have the mentality out of sight, out of mind. We flush it down the drain and it is gone. We don't have to worry about it. But the reality is that's not the case all over the world. Here's a few pictures from different countries where they don't have the treatment. They simply discharge it out into the community at different points. In 2010, the UN recognized safe and clean drinking water as a human right. Poor sanitation is linked to diseases, and it's unfortunate this still occurs because with wastewater plants, we can take care of this. Some of the diseases that are common with wastewater transmission is cholera, diarrhea, dysentery, hepatitis, typhoid, and a few others. And 2 billion people still don't have this basic sanitation, and estimates are around 800,000 people die because of inadequate sanitation. And finally, they say, poor sanitation reduces well-being, social and economic development. And with these pictures, you can easily see that no one wants to be eating at a restaurant if this is going on next door. So the primary driver for wastewater treatment is public health. There are secondary factors, primarily the environment. Discharge of wastewater and pollution and that source can have all kinds of negative impacts on the environment. Organics can deplete the oxygen and result in fish kills. Different materials can wipe out benthic microorganisms, which are the basis of your food chain in your rivers and lakes. And one of the issues that is still somewhat common today is excess nutrients. They can come from a variety of sources, but one is wastewater treatment. but they create algae blooms. I think most of us has probably been to a lake or a river with algae, and it's not, no one enjoys being covered in algae. So we also have to consider other beneficial uses. So industrial consumption, so or livestock irrigation, crop irrigation. If we pollute our rivers and lakes to a certain degree, they can no longer be used for those uses. So we always are looking to protect those uses as well. I thought this was an interesting quote from Les Mis. The history of men is reflected in the history of sewers. So an interesting connection to a pretty popular story there. I'm going to go back and just talk a little more about the long-term history, and you can break it up into 5 main periods. We'll call it early history, the Roman period, the sanitary dark age, the age of sanitary enlightenment, and then the age of stringent environmental standards. So one of the things as you look back, human waste has always been a point of conflict to a certain degree. How do we deal with it? Who should pay for it? Who gets it? And it's not a new problem. It's a problem that's been going on for a long time, and it's going to be a problem going forward as well. So, but it is interesting as I go through the Rochester's history, how people's views have changed and opinions about wastewater. So let's talk, from early history, 3,500 BC to 800 BC. The hunter-gatherers, it really wasn't too big of an issue because they moved. So when they would relieve themselves, you didn't have too much of a problem because you spread out the waste. It's not till people started really living together and staying in a single location that this really started to become a problem. Treatment of wastewater was really a recent development. For the longest time, the primary goal, people didn't understand exactly why, but they knew that they needed, that wastewater caused issues in terms of health. Obviously, we just have a natural ability to look at water and no one wants to drink water that doesn't look clean. So there's some natural abilities that we have, and people quickly realize that if we're going to live together, we need to move this out of our living space. So the Mesopotamian Empire, they were one of the first. Their ruin shows that homes were connected to a drainage system, and the latrines would lead to a cesspit. This was only really for certain. It seemed like the more wealthy homes had this, while a lot of poor people really just threw their excrement onto the streets, which would be tracked around and carry diseases. The Indus civilization, they were the world's first urban sanitation system. They were one of the few that actually did a little bit of treatment. Essentially, they had terracotta pipes, and they would pump it in, or I shouldn't say pump, they would gravity flow into a small pit and let the solids settle out, and the overflow would go back out into a channel. So it's a pretty rude treatment, but pretty impressive for the time that they actually were removing some solids versus just conveying the wastewater. The Egyptians, also the wealthy, they were one of the first to actually have toilet seats in their homes, and they had rude conveyance systems. So you can see in this image here, it would flow down in what is kind of like a half pipe there, I guess. That was only the wealthy, though. the less wealthy had toilet stools, and they just simply put a ceramic bowl underneath. It was interesting. I thought that they would be buried, or at least some folks would be buried with their toilet seat. I'm assuming that the kids maybe didn't want their parents toilet seat passed down through the generations. So the Greeks were kind of the modern forerunners of sanitation. Again, the wealthy had toilet seats in their homes. A lot of times they were made of limestone, but they also were the first to do public latrines. You can see an image here of what they would have looked like. And again, they would essentially have some rough half pipe, and it would flow down and away from your populated areas. The Greeks also did build cesspits and were actually using the waste to irrigate and fertilize crops. So they were one of the first to reuse some of the waste for different purposes. And then the Romans, they reached a different level of engineering. You know, everyone kind of knows about the spas and their aqueducts, which was bringing water in. But what people don't know is the extensive networks of sewers that they also put in. And they also were aware of different water quality. So they knew that the spring water was better for drinking, and surface water from a river or a lake was better for using in the spas or flushing latrines. They also recycled their water. So the water from the spas would actually be used in the latrine. So they would recycle some of that. So they really reached another threshold compared to anyone else. One of the interesting things about them was almost every major city put in an extensive sewer system and stormwater system. The rich had their own houses, but the poor had public spaces. But one of the things the Romans discovered was, again, in the early years, if they didn't convey wastewater for even the lowest class, it resulted in epidemics breaking out. So Rome made sure that even their lowest, poorest citizens had access to sanitation in this manner. So they also built some incredible structures for this. The Cloaca Maxima was essentially a sewer out of Rome. Originally, it was used to drain a marsh that they wanted to build on, but later it was converted to a sanitary sewer, and it went out to the river Tiber, where it was discharged. So again, not treatment, but conveyance, getting it away from the citizens, getting it away from the populated area. And they viewed it as, again, just keeping your population healthy also made it productive. The Cloaca Maxima is actually still in existence today, and I believe parts of it are still used for sewage conveyance. After the fall of Rome, things really took a step back. These are some different images from the mid-centuries there, and it was pretty common simply to discharge your waste out into the streets or relieve yourself in buildings. So you can see a few of the images there. And if you had a castle, you kind of built a vertical pipe for it to fall down. Some places did have a few sewers and there were some cesspits, but ultimately this led to, again, a lot of epidemics, a lot of health issues. And actually it became so polluted at times in different countries that water was considered unhealthy, resulting in a lack of hygiene. When I was getting ready for this presentation, I learned that the wigs that were used in certain countries were to cover up the dirty hair because they didn't want to use the water. They knew, again, humans always kind of have this innate knowing that not to drink contaminated water. But it's interesting, some of the social changes, because they were so fearful of the unhealthy water. So then we get to the Industrial Revolution, and this is really when things start to turn. So essentially, the high increase in population and density caused the need for sanitation. Again, at this point, people kind of knew that they needed to convey the wastewater. They needed to get away from the people. And generally that meant discharging it to your nearest river. So in Britain, they built a very large sewer and discharged to the Thames River, but it became overpolluted very quickly and resulted in what they called the Great Stench. So the river must have been just terrible. But by the late 1800s, people started to look at, okay, we can't simply dilute this in the rivers. There's too many people. It's causing issues. We have to do something about it. So they started working on different technology. One of the things I mentioned here is BOD, which is biochemical oxygen demand. A test we still use today, but one of the first tests to measure how polluted wastewater is. Essentially, it's a measure of organics and how much oxygen it takes to degrade those organics. And so they could start measuring how polluted things were. World Wars, both 1 and 2, really slowed the progress down. At that point, kind of wastewater treatment technology kind of just really stopped. But I think one of the things I want to point out is in 1913, Arden and Locke invented the activated sludge process. That's a huge deal because that's really the basis for most plants. The technology they use today, and I'll get a little more into what an activated sludge plant is, but that's the exact process we use, and I'd say about 80 to 90% of the plants use a variation of this process. So in 1913, it really was the breakthrough for treatment of wastewater versus just simply conveyance and trying to get it away from people. And then finally, the stringent environmental standard period, which really just started in 1970 with the Clean Water Act. So, we're only talking 50 years of really stringent effluent standards. A lot of growth in the science fields really helped progress this, understanding both rivers, lakes, but also how to treat plants. This picture here, essentially, we have an Imhoff tank. It's an older technology, but it is still used. But here's the one I want to point out. This is an activated sludge process, the basic concept. Essentially, your wastewater is going to come in. It's going to go into this aeration tank. We're going to add oxygen or air into this tank. And then we're going to use microorganisms, or I'm going to just refer to them as bugs. And these bugs are not anything special. If you dug in your soil in your backyard, you'd find a similar set of microorganisms. But under that environment, they are going to degrade and reduce pollutants. Once they've reduced the pollutants, they actually come to a settling tank. The nice thing about these bugs is they settle, they sink. So they settle to the bottom and our clean effluent comes off the top. And then what we actually do is actually recycle them back around to go again. So they just constantly go in a loop here. We do have to waste a certain percentage of them. They would overtake our tanks eventually. So there's a wastage portage to this. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means because we have to do something with that waste as well. So that's a very brief history of wastewater. but in general, but now we'll talk about the Rochester plant specifically. So as with most places up until kind of the late 1800s, early 1900s, again, we're conveying our wastewater. Let's get it away from people, which meant we're either discharging into a river, a lake, or just in cases an open field. What happened in Rochester specifically was in 1916, farmers of Cascade Township began to complain about the river conditions. The river was polluted with the wastewater. Their cows, chickens, pigs were dying from drinking the water. They even threatened a lawsuit to the city for being robbed of the natural use of the river. You know, 1916, this is a couple of years after the invention of activated sludge, just keep that in mind. In 1924, the city created a charter that allowed for a sewer plant. One of the things that I'll talk about is the names of wastewater treatment plants have changed over the years. It was pretty common initially to be sewer plants. Now there's varying names. We're currently the water reclamation plant. We're reclaiming water to release the environment. Prior to building that, again, this was a very new science. They didn't, you know, a lot was not known. So officials from Rochester toured the Chicago plant before designing the Rochester plant. And the site is actually on a different site than we're currently located. It's located just north of the current Northbrook Shopping Center. It cost about $276,000 and had a capacity of 2.2 million gallons per day, which is a pretty big plant at that time. They had 3 employees with a combined salary of just over $5,000. I was able to dig up an old photo to give you an idea. This is Silver Lake here. This is 7th Street. And you can see the plant here. It's especially in the early days, odor control was not great. So most of your wastewater plants released odors. Most wastewater plants were built out of town for that reason. However, especially your fast growing cities, soon would overtake and surround the wastewater plant. That's part of the reason that they moved. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but you can see here they were just out of town. And here's an image of it. They actually built an activated sludge plant, which was one of the largest in the US at the time. Rochester claimed that, which was really unique. Again, activated sludge had just been invented 13 years prior to building this plant. So very unique. Here you can kind of see a schematic. The flow would come in, it would go into these tanks and circle around. This is where the microorganisms are consuming the organics. And the way they aerated, they had these pumps in here, which you can see here. They'd pull the mixed liquor, which is the mixture of the bugs, up and spray them on top, and that's how they aerated them. Not the most efficient way to get oxygen in your tanks, and also created lots of odors. So then the mixture of your bugs and your treated wastewater eventually come to a clarifier, it'd settle out, and the treated water would go out. I talked about having to waste. So eventually, if you don't waste some of these microorganisms out, they'll overtake your system. So they put in these sludge drying beds, which is essentially they take the bugs they're wasting out of these tanks and they let them sit out in the sun and they would dry out, and then they could be used as a fertilizer. One issue with drying beds is, again, very odorous process. So lots of odors. So rapid, one of the things you're going to hear me say over and over again is rapid growth. Rochester has grown relatively fast compared to most Minnesota cities. And because of that, the plant was overloaded fairly quickly. industries also played a part in that. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But so essentially by the late 1930s, that plant was overloaded. It was designed for 2.2 MGD, but by that time they were handling about 2.8. So it was already over capacity. They were planning on expanding in the late 30s, but then World War II struck. And so it dropped off. And it wasn't until the 1950s that the discussion picked up again. So from that 1930s to about 1950s, that plant was simply overloaded, which means it did some treatment, but not treatment to the degree that we would want. By the 1950s, again, because it was overloaded and the fact that they used some of the drying bed technology, they decided to move the plant. They moved it 2 miles out of town to our current location right off 37th Street. And that was largely driven by the odors and complaints around the odors. They actually considered postponing it due to the Korean War. There were equipment delays and work shortages or worker shortages, but they pushed through that, and they had a lot of trouble building the plant. They had a cold winter. There was a construction worker strike as well. And it actually ended up over budget as well. So they actually scaled back the plant because of all those issues. They built it for about just over 2 million with a capacity of 7 million gallons per day. But again, it was scaled back from that initial design. It was staffed by eight employees. This is what the plant looked like. If you drove by today, you can still see where the water tower was located, and this building still exists. And actually, most of these buildings still exist out here, and some are still used to this day. The technology, the primary technology, I've talked about activated sludge, where we create a mixture of microorganisms in a free floating suspension, and we aerate them. This used a trickling filter design. Essentially, in these tanks here are filled with rocks, and you actually sprinkle the wastewater over the rocks, and you get the same sort of microorganisms that grow on the rocks, and they do the treatment. So you don't have to provide energy in terms of mechanical means to get air, because the air is as it trickles down through these rocks. You can see in the original design, it was going to be a 2-stage process. They only built 1 stage, and the performance was a little less than they expected, but they also eliminated the 2nd stage, which dropped performance. They also were planning on 4 digesters, and when I say digesters, anaerobic digestion is a popular treatment technology. The bugs were wasting from these different processes. Originally, they just put it on drying beds. We learned that we need to digest them. That essentially means that we put them in a tank under certain conditions, and we'll destroy a lot of the pathogens. It happens to be an anaerobic condition. We actually, at our plant now, use anaerobic digestion. It's about 98 degrees, which is about the same temperature of the human body, interestingly enough. But when we digest those bugs, we can reduce the pathogens significantly and make it a much safer product to dispose of. So that's where these anaerobic digesters were used. This was also, they put the first chlorine contact tank here. Essentially, after we've removed the organics, we'll dose it with chlorine, and that's what they did at the time. And that will kill any remaining pathogens or virus before it's released out into the river. Wastewater almost as always is released out into a local river or waterway, and that's the case for Rochester. And we treat it to what we'll say is what is swimmable standards. So the same requirements as at a beach, essentially, for where people are swimming. So I should say the trickling filters we moved on from, but we kept some of the rock on site. So if you ever do a site visit, I can show you We do still have the rock. We used it to stabilize some of our hills out here. So we reused that rock from the 52 plant. A few pictures here of that plant. So here's the trickling filter. You can see the arms coming out. That is where the wastewater would spray out and then over the rocks. This is the main admin building at that time. One of the things, usually civil engineers were the designers for wastewater treatment plants. Initially, they were really good at designing buildings. So when you see older treatment plants, they usually have these older, beautiful buildings because that's what they knew how to design and how to design well. And then when it came to the processes, not so much. It was still much of a learning curve. So they did have a vacuum filtration system. So one of the things we do is when we generate these solids in the form of these different microorganisms, is they're usually mixed in with liquid. We try and dewater them. It's simply a way to reduce the volume, which reduces conveyance cost of disposal. So think of it as hauling one bucket out to the to dump versus 10 buckets. It just makes it more efficient. So they used a vacuum filter technology, which was really innovative at the time. But I'm not sure. I don't think it worked all that well. So again, continued rapid growth in Rochester. So, and the industries. So Rochester historically has had several dairies, and initially the dairies, nowadays we have pre-treatment requirements. They have to reduce a certain amount of their loading. At this time they didn't, so they would just discharge everything. So there could be huge, massive amounts of dairy waste that would come to the plant, and it quickly overloaded the plant, especially on the solids handling side, which means the digesters that I talked about were digesting the waste bugs. So they actually, again, one of the trends you'll see in Rochester's history and in a lot of places is the original plans were scaled back due to cost, and then they find out that they were essentially had to do that additions later on. So if in the 52 plant, they decided not to build two of the digesters, well, 6 years later, they ended up building those digesters and even building them larger than they originally had planned. And those were about 270,000. And here you can see a picture of what's inside an anaerobic digester. So now we got to the 69 plant. Again, primary driver for this was rapid growth. They picked a different technology here, and I couldn't find in my records exactly why. They actually went back to kind of an activated sludge in combination with a trickling filter. I'm not sure if it was for cost, or it might more likely was due to odors. Trickling filters can be odorous, and there are reports that the odors from the plant were an issue. So it might have been that reason, but I don't really have a firm answer on that. One of the big issues with this plant was while they were building it, and this is a problem we still face, while you're doing an upgrade and expanding a plant, you still have to maintain treatment. We can't tell everyone, hey, for the next 2 years, you can't use your drains. And so one of the upgrades was going to be to the raw pumps. Well, what they planned to do while they upgraded the raw pumps was simply discharge wastewater into the river untreated for about three weeks. And the public got wind of this, and there was a big uproar. The media was involved heavily in this. There was lots of negative articles about what they were doing. Why couldn't they find a way to maintain treatment while they're building these new pumps? And they stopped the project while they looked at different alternatives. The city was claiming that, this is going to cost us a lot of money to do temporary treatment. And, people were saying, that's fine, pay the extra money. We don't want you polluting the river. Ultimately, they compromised. They got some temporary pumps. It did reduce the performance of the plant, the way they operated it, but they were able to maintain a certain level of treatment while they did that. Interesting enough, during the 3 weeks they did that work, Olmsted County Public Health was out day and night at Lake Sumbro monitoring the DO. So very, very concerned about that. Essentially, this is the plant. The modifications, so they changed the pump station. They built the activated sludge plant again. So we're now back to the technology of the 26 plant. But they did add primary clarifiers. So a primary clarifier is essentially a big tank. Think of it as a small lake, and you settle out your solids and you pump them to your digester. Why you do this is it essentially reduces the load on the bugs that need to be aerated. So it's an efficiency thing. You can reduce your aeration requirements, which can save you money. So essentially the flow came in, went through some primary clarifiers here, then the activated sludge plant, and then final clarifiers. And then I should say intermediate clarifiers, because then it would actually go to the trickling filter. So you had a 2-stage system, one level of treatment here, one level of treatment here, and then you go to your final clarifiers, chlorinated and out. They did have a sludge lagoon at this point. One of the things with the sludge or the waste bugs that have been treated safely, no one really knew what to do with it for a long time. So one of the options was to build lagoons and simply store it there. They also put in drying beds again. Again, I think the 26 plant, we went back both to an activated sludge and drying beds. Guess what? It created odors again. So we got more odor complaints. Some pictures of this plant. Just kind of go through these quick. This is at night. One of the questions Abby asked early on, is it manned 24/7? The answer is almost always yes for Rochester. It depends on the technology for other cities. But just some more pictures. These are the clarifiers. This was the activated sludge tank. This was the temporary pumping they did so that they didn't have to release raw wastewater into the river. One of the things they found, obviously we live in Minnesota, snow and ice becomes an issue. You get lots of buildup of frost, and which can create havoc on your system. All right, so now the 1980 plant. So essentially 1 year after the 69 plant, the pollution control agency approached Rochester about tighter limits. So generally speaking, we've talked about expansion because of increased loadings and rapid growth within Rochester. Now this upgrade was really driven, at least in part, by tighter limits. So they were pushing for some pretty stringent limits. And one of the interesting things at this point, before they built the 80 plant, they gave a strong consideration, sorry about that, the intercom is going off. But they gave a strong consideration for actually moving the plant, moving it to near Orinoco or in Orinoco Township. They also considered a sewer district. They considered combining with Dodge Center, Casson, Manorville, Byron, Pine Island, Orinoco. Should stop here shortly, sorry about that. But ultimately, the increased costs for moving the plant and there we go. Again, I apologize for that. The cost for moving the plant was more than they wanted to spend. So they actually decided ultimately to keep the plant at our current location. It was interesting, in one of the articles I read, one of the council members said in the future they may regret us keeping the plant where it is. And to a certain degree, that's true now, again, and it's largely because odor, as the city has grown around the water reclamation plant again. They even considered a buffer zone around the plant, buying some land around the plant ultimately, and just keeping it undeveloped as an odor barrier essentially, but they decided not to do that as either. Then we had, as they were working on this plant, we had the 78 flood. If most folks who have lived in Rochester are aware of this flood. It did submerge a portion of the Rochester plant, and treatment had essentially stopped for a period of time because essentially a lot of the, especially the raw pump station, became flooded. So during this time, people got around the plant at one of the operators brought in a boat, his own personal boat, and that's literally how they got around to the different processes to try and get the plant up and going. They even had an interview on a boat for a new operator at that time. So here's a few pictures. You can see the water flooding the admin building, and here they are on the boat going to different processes. Here are the chlorine contact tanks that were submerged. So as a result of this, we raised the whole site up essentially 4 feet after this flood to protect us in the future. Wastewater plants are typically built in low spots because we like to gravity flow to our system, but that also leaves them susceptible to flooding. So then we get to the 1980 plant. Again, this was largely for lower limits, but it just so happened that there was a bunch of federal money available at this time, especially if you were choosing innovative technologies. So we used an HPO design, which is high purity oxygen. Essentially, that means that instead of normal air and feeding the bugs, we're feeding them high purity oxygen. It's the same thing if you go to a hospital, they give you high purity oxygen to help you breathe better. It's a more efficient process, one that we're still using today. The city only paid 10% of the project cost, and it increased, and the total cost was around 57 million for this project. So the city only paid 10% of that. And the capacity was increased to about 19 MGD. So here's the new layout. So essentially we have new primary clarifiers, a first stage BOD removal, intermediate clarifiers. And people always ask, why are these tanks covered? Because of odor control. Again, common issue. One of the things we can do is simply cover our tanks, and then we can scrub it and treat that air for odors. And then they actually used an innovative process called the flow strip. And I'm actually going to let Wendy's here, Wendy Turry, who's the Public Works Director. She actually worked on this in her, she worked at the plant about this time and actually worked on this process. So I'll let her talk a little bit about it.
Hey everybody, thanks for having us here. It's fun to talk about wastewater. A couple things. Just I came out of college in 82 and was a chemistry degree and was going to be a mad scientist, and ended up getting offered a job here, and I've been working in wastewater for 39 years. So I got the bug. So a couple things that you'll see that odors drove the design of this plant, and innovation, and partially innovation because the plant superintendent at the time really liked to be, creative and look ahead, and also the funding. You could get really good funding, and we had to treat for phosphorus. Not many people had to treat for phosphorus, and nobody in the state was using this kind of a treatment, and this was really using bugs to treat for phosphorus. Instead, they were using chemicals, and chemicals were expensive, and you had to bring them in, and it was not, if you can use bugs, it's much cheaper and better for the environment. So Marvin, Marvin Skoji, he was the plant superintendent at the time, said, let's get this new innovative technology out here. And what the idea was is you would just take like 20 or 30% of the total flow and then get those bugs, you'd put them in a certain condition, get those bugs to release that phosphorus. Because if they only have enough oxygen, just a teeny bit, not too much, basically, they'll release it in a water, and then we would treat that little bit of water because that's where all the high phosphorus would be. And there were a bunch of issues with it because it was new technology. And but then the biggest issue was that you had to treat that water with lime. And I'm a farm girl, by the way. And so that lime, and you mixed it with that water, gave the worst smell. I mean, I worked on a farm, we had dairy, I worked in wastewater, right? I'm tough, but that I would go in there, I would wrap something around my nose, I would hold my breath, because I have to get samples out of this basin and run and get samples, and it was the worst smell. Well, not only that, but mixed with the lime, we had to get rid of that lime, and we land applied it by the airport. And so people were, I mean, it was, if you told people you worked at the wastewater plant, they all hated you because it stunk so bad. So anyone who was around in the 80s might remember it was kind of like a chicken barn, only worse, like fermented chicken barn smell. I can't even. So anyways, because of that, and because it was just difficult, those bugs were finicky, right? And so if you didn't run the plant exactly right, and we didn't know, technology was new, it ended up becoming failed technology, and we ended up going to chemical treatment, but to date, we're back to, and Corey will talk about this, but in the state as a whole, most people who do phosphorus treatment are now using biological treatment, or the bugs to treat, and really using it in a fashion that's different than this, but very similar idea. So this really was a good way to kind of get people started thinking about how to use bugs to treat for phosphorus. Pass it back to you, Corey.
Thanks. And Abby, how much time do we have left here? Make sure.
You still have probably about another 20 minutes.
Okay, perfect.
We have to move into the question portion.
Okay. So Wendy talked a little bit about the FOSTRIP process, which were these tanks here. But essentially, this was the new plant here. These tankage here, these tankage here, and this tank here. And this plant, which was the 69 plant, was actually abandoned at that point. So later it was retrofitted for some other uses, but at that point, they really moved on to this technology here. So a few pictures of construction. So you can see it was quite a big project to build that. I'm going to talk a little bit about a cryogenic air plant. That's how we make high purity oxygen. If you're familiar with Highway 52 and the oil refinery, just north of the oil refinery on 52, they also have a cryogenic air plant. So it's this tall structure. Essentially, it's a distillation column. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. These were the raw pumps. So now we're starting to get into some serious size. So, again, this could treat about, all these pumps could pump about 50 million gallons per day. You always size your plants to make sure that you can pump all the wastewater. I say, our number one job is to pump wastewater. Our number one job is to treat wastewater. Our number one job is to pump wastewater, because we don't want to back up into people's homes and expose them to raw sewage. Also, this is, it's kind of hard to see in this picture, but this is our sphere. So one of the things with anaerobic digestion, where we talked about digesting the bugs to make them safer, that process actually releases methane. And one of the innovative things about this plant was we decided that we will collect that methane. We can store it in this big white, or this spherical structure, which we still use today. And then we can feed it into boilers or generators to either produce our own heat or our own electricity. So that's something we still do today. Some more pictures of the construction here. One of the things that the 80s plant also did was start bringing in automation. Up to this point, most of the changes that would happen in a plant involved an operator walking to a valve or a piece of equipment and doing something. Here, they actually started automating it, which Rochester, again, was one of the first plants in the Midwest to do that. It took a lot of work to automate it. It worked okay. It's come a long ways, I think. Nowadays, again, we can essentially, it only takes one person to operate the plant, and most of what they're doing is sitting at a computer like this, monitoring all the different processes. A lot of it, again, is simply automated. I also want to point out at this point, in this 80s plant, we renamed it from the sewer plant to the water reclamation plant. You know, a sewer just has a negative connotation to it. And the idea of a water reclamation plant is that we're reclaiming water for beneficial use in the environment. So that's what the essence behind the water reclamation plant is. All right, so these are the cryogenic air plants. These two white towers here. One of the things in wastewater treatment, we always build two of everything. The reason being is we can never shut down. Flow will continue to come, so we build two because we eventually will need to maintain and work on one of the items so we can switch to the other. It's interesting they picked this technology. This schematic is how it works. I'm not going to go through this, but I want to give an essence of what it is. And this is actually a simplified schematic. It's a very complicated process, but essentially we're bringing in air. We're going to cool it to minus 280 degrees, at which point oxygen is going to liquefy. Our nitrogen is going to purge off, so we can purge off the nitrogen. We then kind of heat it. We heat up our oxygen again, vaporize it, and then bring it into our bugs. I can tell you it's a complicated process. It is by far and above the most stressful process for our operators. When something goes wrong, you have about an hour to fix it. If you don't, you have to do an emergency shutdown. And then at that point, we have to bring in consultants, and it takes about a week to restart the system. So it's a very complicated process. There's hundreds and hundreds of valves on each box. So while it's definitely innovative, it from an operations point, it's pretty challenging piece of equipment to run. And again, we're still actively using this technology now. We actually have a second redundant system on this. The two kind of circular tanks are actually liquid oxygen backup. So in the event that we do lose this plant or this plant, we essentially can use liquid oxygen that we can buy and vaporize it and put it into the system so we can continue treatment. So shortly after the 1980 plant was put online, we had significant industrial growth, including Libby's, which then became Seneca. And so again, shortly after we built the plant, we were already at our limits. Also, Wendy talked about the FOSTRIP process, and ultimately that was considered a failed technology, which is interesting because actually the essence of that is process minus the lime addition is used today at our plant in the next upgrade. So ultimately, they couldn't get it to work back then, but eventually, again, as the technology advanced, we figured it out. A big part of the 80s project was odor control after the fact. We really started focusing on odor control because, as Wendy mentioned, the lime process really made it odorous. So we started putting in odor scrubbers and covering a lot of our tanks to make sure that we want to be good neighbors, and we still want to be good neighbors, and so it can be a challenge to get those odors under control. So ultimately, with the FOSTRIP failure, our next addition was actually a chemical building addition. So instead of using biological means to remove phosphorus, we use a metal salt, ferric chloride, and that does a really good job of removing phosphorus. again, built in 1989 because that flow strip process actually failed. And again, because of the high loading and the industries and the fact the plant became overloaded almost immediately, they actually expanded digesters again. And again, you're seeing a trend, I'm sure, here with the fact that a lot of these processes are the same. The activated sludge in the 26 and anaerobic digestion, which was put in the 52 plant, we still use today. We've optimized them, but essentially the tanks are essentially just bigger as we treat more and more wastewater. We also started using a different thickening process. This is what we call a gravity belt thickener. Essentially, just think of a conveyor belt, and we feed the sludge on top with the addition of a polymer, and the water falls through and it thickens it up. Again, the reason we thicken sludge is simply to reduce volume. It's easier to haul 1 bucket versus 10. And this is an example of an odor scrubber. So we'll actually pull air from a process like this, which is usually somewhat odorous, and then feed it through here. And there's a chlorine solution that goes over the air that is pretty good at actually neutralizing those odors before we discharge it out. And again, when we built the 80s plant, one of the primary drivers to move it out of town was because of odors. They decided not to. Now our plant is entirely surrounded by the community. So we always focus on making sure that we control our odors. So the 80s plant, even though it was overloaded, did last until about the early 2000s in terms of capacity. However, in the early 2000s, as Rochester continued to grow, we again were overloaded. It was ultimately decided to expand the plant. One of the things that engineers have realized over the time is make sure that your plant that you leave room to expand the plant. Essentially because of the configuration of the HPO plant and the 80s plant, there wasn't room to expand the HPO plant, so they actually built a second plant. It has a 5 MGD capacity, but so we do have 2 plants on site. We talked about the failed flow strip. Well, I actually ended up doing a modification to that system where we do biological phosphorus removal. This means we're using microorganisms, and you can stress them in a certain way and they will actually take up phosphorus. So they can actually do a better job than we can do with chemicals. So that technology is used in our smaller plant. It can get down to like a 0.3, 0.4 phosphorus, where our chemical feed is usually in the 0.8 range. So they also built a new headworks. Again, our #1 A job is pump wastewater, so they expanded the headworks to include fine screens and grit removal. Just removes the heavier debris. And then they also built a second sludge storage tank. Again, one of the things that is a problem for every wastewater plant is how do you get rid of this biosolids, these bugs that have been essentially treated, but you have to get rid of them. Rochester gives them away as free fertilizer to local farmers. So this project was $75 million, and we're currently still paying it off, but I think we pay it off in about 2025 or 2026. So we're getting close to paying that off. And here's the picture of the plant. So essentially this is we call the aeration basin complex plant. So essentially it's a second plant compared to our HBO plant, which is here. And the difference is we use conventional air versus the high purity oxygen. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is it's a more efficient process. This is really good at treating lots of organics, but it also uses a ton of energy, and this process is more efficient. It also allows us to do the bio-P, or the removal of phosphorus with microorganisms. This was the new headworks where they put the new pumps and the new fine screens. They actually put them in the old flow strip process. So we were able to reuse some of the tankage there. And then we also built this sludge storage tank. Essentially, we can only apply our solids in the spring and fall when it's not winter and when crops aren't growing. So we have to store it on site in the spring or summer and winter months. A lot of people also ask about what this structure is. This is an equalization tank. So essentially, our flow is not constant throughout the day. We get flows go up about 8 in the morning, and then we get a little dip in the middle of the day, and then they go up again in the evening as people get ready for work and come home from work. But your plant actually runs better under constant flow. So one of the things we do is we kind of trim those peaks, send it up here, let it sit for the day, and then in the middle of the night, we send it back for treatment, and it just increases the efficiency of the plant. And then the big open area is if we ever have really, really a high rainfall event or high flow event, rainfall works its way into our collection system and can drive up our flows. So normally we're about 14 million gallons per day. If we had a big rain, we can get up to 30, 40, even 50 MGD. One of our approaches is, again, we want to make sure that we pump our wastewater and that your drains work even during a high storm event. We can pump the peak or the top, maybe 10 MGD, maybe 20 MGD, and we can store it up here until the flows go back down, and then send it back into the plant for treatment. So here are some different pictures of the ABC plants, or the new plant. This is a primary clarifier. We're just settling out the solids. It's covered for odor control. This is the aeration basin. It is covered for odor control. And then the final here is exposed. And you can see this when you drive by 37th Street. So the treated water is coming off the top, and the bugs are settling in the bottom and getting circulated back. They also, it's pretty rare to cover aeration basins like this, but again, because of the history of odor issues, they decided to cover these basins. And then this building on top is actually where we house the blowers. So this is how we get oxygen in with the bugs. One of the things that's hard to see in pictures is the scale. So this is the ABC plant. These are diffusers, and here you can see the people, so you get an idea of the scale. These tanks are actually 24 feet deep, so it's pretty deep, and then we force air in through these diffusers. There's essentially nothing fancy about them. It's the same concept of you putting a diffuser into a fish tank, but that's how we get oxygen in there. This is what a blower looks like. Again, you can't really see too much, but and then the tunnels. One of the things that is not common, I'll say, except maybe in the upper Midwest and colder climates, is tunnels. So freezing is an issue. I showed you some pictures earlier about freezing, and it's a lot nicer when everything's inside. It's heated. It's a lot easier for operators to work. So we have an extensive tunnel system. In case you're curious, the color is buff. We paint everything the same color. That's just because it's easier to buy one paint color throughout the plant. This is a final clarifier for that. So again, this is one of the few places in our process that you can actually see the process or the treated water. Just a few more pictures of this upgrade. These are the raw pumps. Give you an idea, each one is 250 horsepower. It can pump about 14 million gallons per day. So if we can pump somewhere in the orders of 60 to 70 MGD. These are the fine screens. Here's a picture of it, the actual screening. As you can imagine, most people have a disgust factor when they look at this, but a lot of things get flushed down the toilet that shouldn't, and we have to screen them out. One of the big ones I try and educate people is, if you're buying non-flushable wipes, flushable wipes, they say they're flushable, but they're not. Toilet paper breaks down in a matter of seconds. We've done studies where you can mix those flushable wipes for hours on end and they don't break down, and they clog our equipment, they clog our pumps. So I'll just use this time to, when I give tours to kids, I tell them the 3 Ps. There should only be 3 things that go down the toilet: pee, poop, and toilet paper. And the kids can usually remember that. So I'll just pass that along here too. Also, the digester, or sorry, this is sludge storage tank. This is our land application equipment. So this is actually how we get the biosolids, which again is a free fertilizer for farmers. We haul it out to fields and inject it into the fields. It gets injected into the field to make sure it's safe. It's generally safe after it goes through our digestion process, but it's even more safe to inject it essentially. And this is what it looks like. It actually turns almost a blackish color after it's gone through our digester. So this is just an aerial where you again can kind of see how the plant's laid out. So our headworks, the HBO plant, the ABC plant, disinfection, anaerobic digesters, solid storage, and solids handling. So again, you can see over the essentially century how things have advanced. You know, there's a lot of tanks, a lot of different processes. Again, our capacity now is about 24 MGD, million gallons per day. So, and we treat about 13 or 14 MGD on a typical day.
Corey, can we start transitioning into the question and answer portion?
Yeah, yeah.
I see them coming in.
Sure. Why don't we stop here then?
Great. All right. Pull these up. Okay. So the first question is in regards to the bugs, the microorganisms you've been talking about. Who or how were the bugs discovered as useful in this process? Like, who came up with that?
Yeah, so that goes back to the 1913. That's when they discovered that activated sludge process. And again, the bugs themselves are nothing special. If you looked under a microscope and compared it to soil, if you took some soil from your backyard, you would find a lot of the same or similar microorganisms. Essentially what we do at a wastewater plant when we're using these bugs is what nature does naturally. We're just speeding it up and we're concentrating it into one spot. So yeah, that 1913, the lock, I forget his first name, but it was Lockett that discovered that process.
And where do you guys get the bugs? I'm just curious. You know, obviously you can't order them off Amazon. Like dig out back or? So,
you theoretically, if you started up a new plant, you wouldn't, a lot of times we'll seed it from another plant. But the reality is eventually, if you just started putting wastewater, they would grow on their own. They're just so abundant that it would take off. So, but that would be a really slow process. So typically if you're starting a new plant, and we've had other cities request this of us, we'll actually send them a tank load of our bugs to seed their process and start their process up.
So you were talking earlier about phosphorus and the difficulties of trying to get that out of the system. Are there any other pollutants or things that are still problems to get rid of?
Yeah, so wastewater treatment is it's constantly evolving. As we learn about the dangers of new and different pollutants, we're constantly looking at what can we do to reduce that. So, for example, we remove phosphorus, we remove the organics. We also remove ammonia. Ammonia becomes toxic to aquatic life, so we remove ammonia. One issue that's kind of up and coming, we're not sure how it's going to play out yet, but are chlorides or salt. Salt comes from, is ending up in our rivers, and it comes from pretty much 2 places, road salt and then water softeners. So our plant does not remove chlorides or salt. there is the technology to do that. It's extremely expensive. There's always a trade-off with treatment. If we wanted to remove it, we could, but it would be on the order of, hundreds of millions of dollars to do that.
That sounds very expensive when you're still paying off the last plant upgrade.
Yeah.
So how did the operating system change with the invention of computers? Were there pieces that still had to be handled manually?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our SCADA system, which is the computer system to control our plant, was really put in the 80s. There was a big resistance from the operators. They didn't feel like they could trust it. And it took time. And nowadays, a lot of the system is automated. There are still pieces of equipment that they have to go over and turn. We kind of selectively decide which equipment to automate. So if a valve isn't going to be used very often, we may not automate it just to reduce the cost of maintaining that valve. But for example, our screening system, if our screen gets bind, a second screen will automatically turn on because we have sensors in place to monitor that. And so a lot of automation is really going to get built in. And I see that only continuing in the future.
So if you have to shut down, and I know we talked about redundancies, but what happens to the unprocessed wastewater and how long can you wait before it becomes an issue?
So we never shut down. We treat all the time. We have redundant systems. So like each tank is going to have 2 pumps. When we, if that pump breaks, we simply switch over to the other pump until we can repair. So essentially we never stop treatment. You can think of it since 1926 minus, even during that 69 plant they treated. So we've never shut down treatment since 1926.
So 5 more years and it'll be 100 years of continuous treatment.
Yep, exactly.
Could any of the byproducts from the plant be used to produce energy or to power the plant?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the methane, again, we talked about the anaerobic digesters, they produce methane. So there's a seasonal use. In terms of the winter, we send that methane to boilers to heat the plant. So generally speaking, even though we have a lot of buildings, a lot of structures to heat, we don't buy any natural gas. We heat it all ourselves. In the spring, summer, and fall, we actually send that into our on-site generators and generate some of our own electricity, so we can offset some of our costs with that. And then the biosolids, again, is a resource that is a free fertilizer, and the farmers generally love it. It works great, and obviously the price is right for them. So
Free is always the best. One of our younger audience members wants to know, how do they clean out the screens?
So the cleaning is automated. So you couldn't tell from the pictures, but essentially, again, most of our processes are automated. There's essentially a brush that cleans off the screen, and then we actually clean the screening. So once we brush it off, we hose off the screenings, clean it up. That reduces odors, and then we put it in essentially a giant garbage bag, and it gets incinerated.
All right. And has Rochester considered citywide water softening like Minneapolis and St. Paul water systems?
Well, unfortunately, Rochester, again, this is RPU, or Rochester Public Utilities, is responsible for the water side of things. We're just wastewater, but Rochester is on a well system. So I forget the exact number of wells, but it's 20 or so, or maybe even more. But because you're pulling up well water from so many different places, building a lime softening plant would be really difficult, because you'd have to combine that or build lime softening at each well house. So it's an exorbitantly expensive proposition. as we look at that problem, we want to, I think in the future we'll be looking at how can we reduce the chloride use. Water softeners are becoming more efficient and smarter, so that might be the best approach.
And you mentioned this earlier before our audience members came on, but can you talk a little bit more about your ability to track diseases in the community through wastewater?
Yeah, I didn't think about adding this, but since COVID, the COVID epidemic, we actually are measuring COVID in the wastewater. So essentially we can take a single sample and measure the entire population of Rochester in terms of COVID. We don't have the science down. It's a rapidly evolving science. We can't tell exactly how many people have COVID, but we can watch the trend. So we can say that, the COVID numbers are increasing, which means there's more COVID, and we'll pass it along to the city leaders so they can make good decisions based off of that. But it's incredible. It tracks it incredibly well with the county numbers in terms of confirmed cases, what we see in the wastewater.
And do you have enough emergency generation to keep running if there's a power outage at the plant?
Yeah, so we kind of have a couple levels of redundancy there. We have 2 feeders into the plant. So if we lost one feeder, we essentially can switch over to another feeder. In the event that goes down, if we lost both feeders, the generators that we use to generate our own electricity can also run off natural gas, and we can run not our entire plant, but large portions of our plant. So we could keep the wastewater flowing even if we didn't have power.
Christine noted that the same 100-year anniversary for the wastewater treatment plant is also our founding for the History Center. So we'll have to have some sort of joint birthday celebration.
Yeah, we can host it out here and you guys can come see.
I don't know, based on the odor, I feel like we should be the ones hosting.
We feel like the odors are not near as severe as they used to be. I know I talked a lot about that, but so.
Do all homes and businesses have a separate sewage and runoff system? You mentioned at the beginning, those like 2 different pipes. Does everyone have that?
Yeah, so they should. Generally speaking, your sanitary sewer should not be combined with any storm sewer. This is the case for Rochester, where our sewers are completely separate, the storm sewer and the sanitary sewer. But if you go to the older cities out east, a lot of those sewers are still combined, and they're in such high residential areas, it's hard to separate them. So those cities have to take really inventive methods to deal with the high flows that they get. But fortunately for us, we don't really have that problem since we do have separate sewer systems.
So Christine had another question. There's currently housing on the old 7th Street location where the original plant was. Did you have to do anything to treat the ground when they relocated the plant, or was that not needed?
That I don't know the specifics on. They had sludge drying beds, which usually have a layer of protection built underneath. However, that 1926 plant, it was just a different time. So I think they only tore that plant down. It was in the 70s or 80s, but so I'm assuming by that time they would have done a pretty thorough investigation into the source water there. But I don't know that for sure.
And when did you start providing the fertilizer to the farm fields?
That is a good question. Wendy, do you know?
I believe it started, I want to say in the late 70s. And then EPA wrote some pretty strict requirements, I think in the early 80s that, so anywhere we put it, we have to track, how many metals go on, we track a lot of different organics, and that's forever, right? And there are caps. None of our fields are approaching those caps, but there are caps. So if you happen to have an industry in town that uses a lot of metals, you could trip one of those, and then you can never put back on that site. So there's lots of regulations around that site.
Okay.
And that's one thing I didn't talk a lot about, but we have a lab on site. We probably do several hundred samples a week. And we have to monitor every single day our effluent to make sure that we're complying with our requirements.
So you talked about how industries can produce, like different industries produce different types of waste. What kind of industries, especially in this area, produce the most? You know, like what are the most problematic?
Well, it can really vary. You know, for a long time, dairies were the primary industry in Rochester, and they can produce a lot of waste. One of the tactics people are doing now, though, is, you know, and we're looking at this to extent, is trying to take some of that waste, not put it in our liquid process, but put it in directly in our anaerobic digesters. So it doesn't use up capacity in the liquid side, but will produce more methane, which we can use to generate electricity. So, but the dairies, they're high, they, you know, that there's a lot of organics there, but they're not too bad to treat, generally speaking. There are other wastes that can be more challenging to treat. So it really depends on the industry. So some industries are more challenging. And one thing we do struggle with to some degree is almost all these industries that are food-based have pretty extensive cleaning requirements. And so they're trying to kill bugs. Well, then they use this, the cleaning stuff goes down the drain. We're trying to grow bugs. So we have to be careful, and we have to work closely with them so they don't dump enough to inhibit our process or affect our process.
So we have a question. What is the state of microplastic pollution coming, for example, from artificial fiber laundry lint in the sludge? I imagine this is an emerging area of attention and also an expensive thing to deal with.
Yeah, it is. That is, it's definitely something we're tracking. I haven't seen as much about it recently, but yeah, there's definitely the fibers that come in. And we're definitely going to remove a good portion of that just because the characteristics of it. But some of it definitely is going to go through our plant. Again, there is technology out there to remove it, but it is pretty expensive. So this is a scenario where in the perfect world, we stop, you know, we prevent the pollution instead of treating it. You know, that's what we'd like to see.
And I think the state has encouraged people to stop using it, you know, because just for that reason, it's very difficult to treat. So I think we're seeing less.
And then do you have any comment about PFASs and other forever chemicals? I am not a scientist.
So yeah, the PFAS is definitely something we're tracking. Where this is, I won't say a new problem, but a relatively new problem. Essentially, PFAS is think of Scotchgard or your pans at home that are non-stick, or you know, a lot of carpets are non-stick. Those they call forever chemicals because we have a really hard time breaking them down. We're still trying to study it. Again, the key with this one at this point is prevention. So some of the biggest users was and still is firefighting foam. It's heavily in firefighting foam, and so they're working on transitioning firefighting foam away from that, or at least collecting it and recycling it. But the PFAS is really in everything. It's kind of scary, to be honest. You know, if you go to a fast food chain, a lot of their stuff is coated in PFAS to prevent grease and from sticking, and so again, there really is no treatment for that. We would like to see the materials banned because we can't remove it. They've even shown that, you know, you can try and use combustion to break it down, but they're finding that you can't even completely break it down. So again, this one's something we're tracking. We're going to try and work with our partners in the city to try and identify and eliminate the use of it. But it's tricky because it's in so many products nowadays.
So going back to earlier, you were talking about things that go down the toilet that aren't supposed to. What's been the most unusual thing that you've found during the treatment process?
Oh, they now that the screening system's automated, we don't pay that close attention. But I know in the past they'll find money, lots of kids' toys. So I imagine the kids get left alone in the bathroom and flush their toy down the toilet.
When I was there, we had the older system, and a wooden leg was probably the thing I remember thinking, how in the world?
Yeah, how do you lose that?
I don't know.
I feel like you're missing out on a lot of things with this new automated screening process.
We don't have too many volunteers to monitor that system, looking for interesting things.
Yeah. Just there strictly in an interest capacity. So I guess, and this is more for my own clarification. So once the water has gone through the treatment process, you then pump it into the river? Where does it go next?
Yeah, it discharges into the river.
Okay.
So, one of the trends, there's a few trends emerging in the wastewater field. One is reuse. Fortunately for us, groundwater and water sources are plentiful, but if you go to the Southwest, that's not the case. And so wastewater plants are starting to really be looked at as in terms of reuse in water. Now, right now, most of that's, if you go out there and you see, also, it's always the purple pipe. Those are reuse pipes, and they use them for like irrigating golf courses or for industrial users. But I know Arizona just passed a law that allows, with proper treatment, essentially to connect their wastewater plant to their drinking water plant. I don't think any plants have done that yet, but it's the first time they've allowed it to occur. So as water becomes scarce in certain part of our countries, I think wastewater plants are part of the solution.
That makes sense. It's a finite resource, and while there's a ton of it here, eventually we are going to run out.
Yeah.
I think that's it for all of our questions. So we're going to wrap up. So I want to say thank you so much to both our audience for asking so many great questions, and to our presenter. Wait, I have one more question. Are there currently any complaints from towns or people downstream?
Not that we get. Again, if you look at our effluent quality to the general river quality, a lot of times ours is in terms of solids, BOD, and a lot of different measures, ours is cleaner than the river. And actually, even in dry years, under really dry years, we make sure that water keeps flowing, and so there's aquatic life that can keep living. Otherwise, the river can get too low, and they can actually cause impacts there too. So, no, we don't get any downstream complaints, at least while I've been here.
Back in the 1980s, before we had phosphorus treatment, that causes more eutrophication, and once it got to Lake Zumbro, it kind of sits in this pool and builds. And actually, we had to, one of the requirements was to get out there and sample, and then it did cause a lot of blue-green algae. I mean, there were parts of that lake that were completely covered with blue-green algae in the 80s, early 80s.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, again, thank you so much for all of those great questions. And also thank you to both of our presenters for their time and sharing their expertise with us. We hope that you enjoyed tonight's program and that you continue to join us in the future as we discuss everything from the history of fashion to the 1918 flu pandemic and so much more. Check out our website, olmstedhistory.com, to keep up to date on all of our events and programs. If you enjoyed tonight's program, consider making a donation to help us continue to offer this and other great programs here at the History Center, or consider becoming a member. A History Center of Olmsted County membership offers a wide variety of benefits, including access to free and reduced cost events like this. Thank you so much again to everyone who joined us tonight, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event.